Hello, welcome to this week's edition of Sermon Scraps. We're going to be covering the past 2 weeks because last week after the service, I went up to Chaminade for our district's fall teaching conference. So we're going to talk about elders and deacons today. One of the things that I didn't get to with with elders last week was the reality of plurality of elders throughout the New Testament. So anytime the word elder is used throughout Scripture, it's always in reference to the plural, which many people take to mean that the office of elder should be plurality, should be multiple people who are serving in this office. It's not reserved for just one person. One of the pieces that I didn't have a time to get into last week was verse 6 in particular. It says, he must not be a new convert, or he might become conceited and incur the same condemnation as the devil. Um, this is, I think, the condemnation of the devil is connected to conceited, and C.S. Lewis actually argues that the first sin that occurred in the world is the sin of pride, and then pride is the sin that is at the root of every other sin that comes out. So pride is what led to the devil's fall. He wanted to become God himself. So pride is at the core of every single other sin. All right, so that's it for deacons. I talked a lot about them that week, and just a helpful overview, I think, of what Paul expects from the role of deacon. Of elder. Now I want to talk about deacons for a little bit. And this is the article that I mentioned on Sunday. It's titled "The Authority of Deacons in Pauline Churches" by Benjamin Merkel. He serves as a professor at Southeastern Baptist Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina. This is another one that was helpful: servants as assistants, carrying out the will of another. And this is a article that is referenced in this book, Paul's Vision for Deacons. So again, these are the books that I recommended for a better understanding of what the office of a deacon is. This one, I disagree with some of his articulation of deacons being shock absorbers. I don't think that's necessarily the most helpful way of articulating the role of deacons. I think it's more helpful to say that they're in their role to help preserve the unity. This one, where I disagree with Strauch, is he thinks that deacons is reserved for men, similar to the office of elder. So I have some disagreements with Strauch on that specific issue. Read both of these; you'll get a pretty good, I think, summary of many of the debates or conversations about this. But those books actually make reference to some of these articles as well. And then there's a third one that I wasn't able to find. So I read a summary of it, which someone did a PhD dissertation looking at all the semantic range for the deacon words in the Greek. And there's 3 or 4 different words that are used regularly. And like this one looks at some of the deacon words in like other first century and that era of history writings to try to get an articulation of what does this word specifically mean. So I like what Benjamin Merkel says as some of the distinction between deacons and elders. So there's 4 descriptors that he gives for what the deacon's office is supposed to be. He says, and I quote, "Deacons held an official and authoritative, yet non-essential and subordinate position in the Pauline churches." So the 4 things are official, authoritative, non-essential, and subordinate. Those are the characteristics that are true of deacons, according to Benjamin Merkel, and I agree with his research and writing and articulation. So the official piece means that it is recognized and affirmed by the apostles. This is a specific church office. The second is authoritative. They have a role of authority within the church. That means deacons should be listened to and sought out in church matters that are going on. However, he goes on and says non-essential. What that tells us is a church can be a church without deacons. So deacons aren't required for a church to be a faithful church. But once it grows to a certain size, deacons would serve as an incredibly helpful role. And some of the reason that he makes that articulation is in Titus 1:5. So there's 3 letters that Paul wrote that are referred to as the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy and Titus. These are books that are specifically written to pastors to talk about the ways that the church is supposed to function, ways that churches are supposed to faithfully pursue being a church. In Titus 1:5, Paul specifically says, "The reason I left you in Crete was to set right what was left undone, and, as I directed you, to appoint elders in every town." Again, note that it was plural, and elders are appointed in every town, which means it is essential for churches to have elders. The last piece is subordinate. So official, authoritative, non-essential, and subordinate. That is that deacons are to serve under the elders. They are assistants to the elders. That's some of where This one, I think, is helpful. Servants as assistants, that idea or articulation that it is. Again, I like the idea. I shared this on Sunday of overlapping spheres of influence, but the deacons are tasked from the elders and overseen and managed by the elders. So you can't have a church without deacons. You can't have a church without elders. But as a church grows, similar to what we saw in Exodus 18 with Moses, it is imperative for deacons to be called and affirmed so that the elders can continue focusing on ministry of the word and prayer. Now, I had a great question on Sunday. I'll shout out to Andrew Reese, who grabbed me after the service to ask this. Um, his question was, does that mean elders aren't supposed to be waiting on the tables or some of those kinds of things? And I said, absolutely not. Elders aren't off the hook for being the number one servants in the church. But what we should be looking for is if some of the ministries that are taking place in the church are taking the elders away from the word and prayer that we are primarily called to focus on, then it becomes an issue. It becomes a problem. It means we're not actually called to operate and exist in what we're supposed to do. Great, just an example of this. My kids were, and like, I wrestle sometimes sharing some of these stories because so please don't take this as me trying to like toot my own horn, but I only have my life to share examples and illustrations from, so I will share this story. But there was a Sunday morning where Kara was busy and I was on the music team, so the kids were in the auditorium at the very front, just playing, and we had some snacks for them. So obviously, in the course of eating the snacks, there were a bunch of crumbs and food remnants that were left on the floor, and it was right before service started, so I just ran to get a vacuum and started vacuuming it up and cleaning up after the kids. And someone in church actually grabbed me and said, "I am really thankful to see you up there cleaning the food here." At one of the churches we attended, the pastor refused to do any of this work and said it wasn't his job. So that to me is just a picture of all of us are called to serve the good of this body. But like if I were expected to be cleaning up the entire church every single week, it would take away from me being able to pray for you guys, from me being able to sit and read and study and prepare the sermons that I preach every week. So I'm always willing to help out wherever necessary. But if I am always doing those kinds of things, then it prevents me from doing the primary thing that I've been called and commissioned to do in this church. So to summarize the distinction and difference, I think elders are the ones who are called to lead and oversee the church. That's it. Elders are the primary office. Then the elders call and commission deacons who can serve for as short or as long as the elders deem necessary. Now, it's important to remind us that when we select elders, it's not a popularity contest. We're not choosing elders to represent a constituency in the church. Like we've got the older elder that is the 60 and up. We've got a 50 to 60 elder. Now, there may be some wisdom in that of having people that have different stages of life and different experiences to speak into that. But it's not necessary. It's important for us to remember that the church is a theocracy, not a democracy. We particularly in America, we just tend to view all these things the exact same way that we elect leaders for our nation. Now, part of the difficulty is that theocracy is a little bit harder to follow because we don't have a human person that's going to come and tell us exactly what to do. But what I would articulate, what I would argue is what we see taking place in the church with the like nomination and election of elders. Our elders are actually called by God. It's not just us that are coming up with proposing these names. We have leaders that are chosen by God. Then we as the congregation affirm them. And then once they're affirmed, we actually follow their leadership. I think that's the clear delineation that we see throughout Scripture. And that's somewhere like I've talked about this. I talk about this regularly in the membership class. Like every church I've been at has had someone who has told me, well, I always vote no to anything that comes up in the congregational meeting because we can't have a 100% vote. And like the older I've gotten, the more I've just been like, that's just nonsense. Because if we're all keeping in step with the Spirit, if we're all working to preserve unity, if we're all praying about these decisions, if this is the person that God has chosen, then there should regularly be unanimous votes that are taking place in our congregation. And I've been thinking about this particularly with the Bereans. Like people will just often throw out, well, I'm trying to be a good Berean. And the issue is we just are so hyper individualistic in our culture today that even when we read something like the Bereans, we just take that to mean me individually, I need to be a Berean. But if you read the text, that's not actually what it is. If you don't know the story, it's a reference to Acts chapter 17. And I'll just read the text really briefly, and then I'll share some of where we get off. So Acts 17, beginning in verse 10, it says, as soon as it was night, the brothers and sisters sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. Upon arrival, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. The people here were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, since they received the word with eagerness and examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Consequently, many of them believed, including a number of the prominent Greek women as well as men. So the way I was always taught to read that or interpret that growing up is every time the pastor gets up to preach, I need to go look at the Bible myself and determine or figure out if what he's saying is actually correct. But where we get off is we miss that this was actually taking place in the context of the local church. It wasn't an individual sitting by themselves determining whether or not what the preacher was saying, in this case, Paul, what Paul was saying was actually true. It was them talking together, probably with Paul, to try to determine what do you mean by this specific thing. Because you notice verse 10, it says they went into the synagogue. That would be our equivalent of gathering together as a church. They didn't go into their individual homes and then cast stones or dispersions upon what Paul was saying. And then it says they received the word with eagerness. They were excited. They were always focused on the word. Now, they didn't have the New Testament. They only were using the Old Testament. And so Paul was able to use the Old Testament to point them to the reality of who Jesus was. And then it says, examine the scriptures daily. But the pronoun connected to that is they. So again, all of this is taking place within the context of a community. And the community of the church is going to be organized with elders and with deacons and with members who are nominating, electing, supporting, and following, submitting to the leadership of the elders. So one really brief example of just like a time where I think it would have been helpful for the elders to have selected a deacon would be in the midst of COVID. I thought that was a perfect time to like call up and affirm a deacon who had some medical expertise that could have helped provide some guidance for us during that season. I moved here in the middle of COVID stuff, and it was really difficult for us to try to navigate some of those conversations. None of us had medical expertise. We were relying on conversations that we were having with other people and trying to prayerfully determine the best ways to move forward. But then, like in the midst of that, I think it could have been helpful to nominate someone to form a team that could then make recommendations to the elders on how we should proceed forward. And then once the COVID season had kind of passed, then that deacon could have been disbanded and redirected in serving into some other areas in the church. Some other places that I think would be helpful to have deacons would be finances. Someone that helps us manage and budget and plan and all those pieces that go into the financial side of the church. Facilities is another one. Eric does a great job with that, and looking for someone to help us manage and take care of and steward the building that God has provided for us. Welcome team is another great place for deacons to serve. Music is a great place for deacons. Parking team, even at some point, like if we get too many cars in here, having someone help with some of the parking would be a great deacon role. Website, if someone's gifted with managing websites, that's another place for deacons to serve. So just some examples that I've been thinking through of what are some ways or opportunities for us to affirm, recognize, and call deacons in the midst of the ministry of what God is doing here in South Suburban. Again, if you have any questions about any of this, would like to talk further about the two offices, why I think these two offices are important for us as a church, feel free to reach out to me. I will continue our series in 1 Timothy this next week. We're done with church offices, starting to look at just a really cool creed this coming Sunday, summation of focusing on who Jesus is. So it'll be fun for us to dig into that together. I hope the Lord blesses you this week, and I look forward to seeing you again on Sunday morning.